Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 51, and we're going to talk about which came first, slavery or racism. And then we're going to talk about the problem of having just two choices. Ooh, you can see where this is going to go. But anyway, I would throw that question out: which came first, racism or slavery, slavery or racism? Early in the race class I used to teach, and people would answer all the time. I would say, okay, who thinks that slavery came first? People would raise their hand. Who thinks that racism came first? And people would raise their hand. And then I would ask a third question. I would say, why did you answer? Now, just to put things a little bit in context, this was a heavily debated question by some people once upon a time, perhaps probably not so much now. But once upon a time, people would publish an article making the case for slavery came first, and then other people would publish an article or a book that said that racism came first, and so on and so forth. The reason why this was kind of an important question to try to answer is because if slavery came first, then there was some sort of hope that society could teach racism out of society, right? So you could focus on early childhood education, make your children's TV shows a certain way, and so to get people to not be racist. But if racism came first, then there's not a lot of hope in getting rid of this thing we call racism. Now, obviously, if you've been listening to this podcast, if we want to get technical, then racism came first, but not in the way that a lot of people are thinking. Just go back to my episode 14, where we talk about institutional racism. Racism alone is not enough, right? Just because you have, bad feelings towards a certain group of people, that's not enough, right? We also have to keep in mind that slavery did not exist everywhere where there was racism. It's this slavery racism phenomena is not just something that happened in Africa. It's not just a white black thing. But if you've been listening to me, then you already know this. Racism, discrimination can happen through religion, tribal affiliation, geographical hometown, origin, all these different ways that we can create racism. But that in and of itself is just simply not enough. And the biggest limiting factor of this progression from racism to slavery is that slavery is really expensive. A lot of people have been taught that slavery is free, it's cheap labor, and that is like the last thing, really. I mean, I guess on a superficial level, one could say, oh, yeah, I'm not paying the slaves anything. Yeah, but if you are a good slave owner, you want healthy slaves. So you got to feed them, right? You got to clothe them, you got to house them. And so now we're talking about a lot of expenses. You have to feed, clothe, house your slaves, even when they're not working, when they're too young and too old. I mean, what are you going to do? And so even when they're not working in the off season or whatever, you still have to maintain the slave. So it's really, really expensive. It's not cheap in any sense or any way that you can imagine it. So the reality is that people in the US and maybe elsewhere have been socialized to try to answer any question that they are given, right? So to say, I can't answer that question is sometimes heard, but generally really not the case. And especially when people have no knowledge of a subject, they will try to answer the question even more. So people will use their current understanding, use their own logic, but no new information, right? They're not going to research, they're not going to try to Google anything. And so if we assume socialization in their education, and we talked about that early on in episode 4, I guess, if we assume a lot of socialization in their early childhood development, then it's more likely than not that they will go along with the question and try to answer racism or slavery. And so basically they're answering according to their socialized education. It's very, very limited, and they're perfectly comfortable with just choosing between two choices. Add to that individual experiences, and then, there you have it. That's why you have a little bit of difference. But I'll sort of, you know, jokingly chastise the class. And I said, you didn't even do a deconstruction, right? And we go over this in episode 5 and 6. You didn't even ask what the words meant. You just assumed that you knew what the words meant, and you just proceeded to try to answer the question. So what is the problem of trying to answer slavery came first or racism came first? And the fundamental problem is that it ignores everything else, right? So what was the economy like? What was trade like? Was there a drought? What's the structure of the government? Was there a dominant religious belief? These kinds of questions, no one is even thinking about it. And so, especially since everyone, when they think about race and slavery, they're immediately thinking about slavery here in the United States. But that's not the only place where slavery took place. In fact, I think it was something like, of all of the slaves taken out of Africa, 8% came to the United States, 8%. And the rest of all of the people taken out of Africa mostly went to South America. Okay. And so no one's really considering that. They're only thinking about a very narrow situation and trying to make it fit there. There was I remember seeing this documentary. You can see it on YouTube. I think it's free there. It's called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And it explains the rise of societies and why certain societies, civilizations were able to dominate over others, never once mentioning the color of people's skin. Check it out. It's like 2 hours long, I think. It was pretty good. And totally different subjectivity, and it does kind of challenge most of the racial discourse that we hear today. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there. So there's no reason to ban the discussion like it. You can't outlaw or censor people asking which came first, racism or slavery. But to write policy or to write rules and regulations based on this debate will lead to all kinds of problems, right? Because it ignores too much. It's going to assume like you understand the problem, therefore you understand the solution. And so you're going to give money to all of these organizations so they can spend the money and solve racism, right? Which is impossible, because we always discriminate. We always have to distinguish between this and that, right? Even if you were to date a person who's a twin, right, an identical twin, you got to be able to distinguish between, right, the person you're going out with and the other sibling, right? That's discrimination, right? And so life is all about discrimination. You cannot do away with racism, right, in the sense of discrimination. So there it is. People will write about it. Okay, fine. Maybe if you want to kill some time, you're bored, you can talk about it. Sure, it's interesting. A lot of people will say all kinds of things, and if that's what you're into, then okay. But it doesn't really get you anywhere. It doesn't help you to solve much of anything. The interesting thing, too, is once you realize that there are many situations where we're given just two choices and we have to choose either or. The biggest one, the most blatant one, is the two-party system here in the United States. You got to choose Democrat or Republican, right? So everything is reduced to a couple of issues as if nothing else mattered, right? So politicians are always telling us what we have to worry about, that these issues should help you decide who to vote for, right? Ukraine or Russia, immigration or walls, right? Abortion or pro-choice. or was that pro-life? So, they shove these issues in your face, and based on these two choices, Democrat or Republican, you're supposed to make a choice that's going to make your life better. And the question really is your life going to be better if you choose for one or the other person? Like, one question I always ask is, what about food, right? Who, by voting for this person or that person, is it going to be easier for me to buy food? Is food going to be cheaper? Is food going to be a higher quality? No one really seems to ask that question. And then if you do ask that question and you say, well, I would like a third choice, people say, oh, you're wasting your vote, right? And what a lot of people don't realize is that the two-party system here in America is a corporate structure, okay? Sort of like the WWE, worldwide entertainment, right? And so basically it's fake wrestling, or even the NFL, right? So in the NFL, National Football League, American football, you have all these teams pretending to compete against each other, when in reality, they all work for the same corporation, the NFL, right? I mean, you got individual owners of certain teams, but you got to realize that there's profit sharing. There's all these different rules in place to ensure that certain teams cannot go totally bankrupt, right? And so there's this profit sharing scheme which keeps everyone in the business. So even if your team is like the absolute worst, it's okay, right? Somehow you get to make money from it. Another interesting example would be Major League Baseball here in the United States. And if you have not watched Moneyball with Brad Pitt in it, that is an excellent movie. You get to see math in operation, a practical situation where math, sabermetrics, right, is used to revolutionize the sport, at least the way Major League Baseball is played. But if you look, the team that Brad Pitt works for, character Brad Pitt is playing, is a very small market team. So their budget is very, very small. So why don't they go out of business? Because of, the corporate structure, which ensures that even a team I think they were this California Angels, what was that? LA Angels, well, the Angels, I think, whatever. I forget what team they were. But anyway, that team, they get to hang around, right? So in other words, they don't go bankrupt. And so they're all actually working for the same corporation. But the reason why they'll do that is that it's a lot harder for there to be new competition. And so they get to play their game. They get to maximize all of the profits, and they never have to fear for more competition, right? An alternate football league, alternate baseball league, right? And you have all these other rules that come into play. So Democrats and Republicans, the corporate structures is set up in such a way that it is extremely difficult for there to be a third party, okay, whether it's the Green Party, Libertarian Party, or whatever, right? It's very, very difficult. So now you're going to have all these diverse people with different concerns, mixed concerns, right? Because not all Democrats are the same, not all Republicans are the same. And so now you got to choose which party you're going to vote for based on certain issues. It's very reductionistic, right? That's the term that we use in race theory. So you're going to create a race, but you're going to force everyone in that category, even if they don't really fit neatly. We're going to reduce the qualities or characteristics of everyone in this race to one. So that reductionistic thing is, in race theory, we say it is racist in and of itself, right? And so now everything we see around us, though, is reductionistic, right? It reduces your choices to two, and so now you have to choose either or. Everything else is ignored. It's as if we have the right position on Ukraine or Russia, you'll have plenty to eat, right? You'll be happy, right? Your life will be awesome. You'll be able to find a job easily, right? Which is kind of weird because we know that's not true, but that's the way it is. So people are so busy arguing their issue, abortion or drugs or whatever, that they don't notice that the government is extremely irresponsible with the debt. The debt is exploding. The scope of the government, their ability to intrude into our lives is growing. And now it's so bad now that we're voting between Biden or Trump, which is kind of ridiculous, really. I mean, really? That's the choice. The two best examples of Americans, Biden or Trump. It's just really odd. You may like one or the other. That's fine. But why? Why do we have to choose between this person or that person? And if you really study the whole political dynamics, it's a crazy world. We're not really participating in a voting scheme. We're kind of participating in upholding the corporate structure of Democrat, Republican, right? Because they're on the same team. In the same way, by rooting for your favorite football team, you're actually supporting the NFL. So by voting for Republican or Democrat, we're actually supporting this corporate structure that exists in Washington, D.C. I mean, to simplify it a little bit, because we only have a few minutes. So people are so busy arguing that they don't notice the collusion between these two parties, right? And it's kind of interesting that Trump, who is kind of an outsider, is hated by both parties, right? It's like, how did this guy get in here? And they're always trying to get rid of this guy. So the race slavery question is like the election question in a lot of ways. We're going to ignore a lot of issues, significant issues, personal, individual issues, just so that you can have bragging rights. My side won, right? That's really all that happens, right? And if your side wins, then you get more funding for whatever, right? But is your life better, right? Is your life somehow, more fulfilled now that you get to say, hey, I had the right position. I voted for the one who won the election, or whatever. I mean, it doesn't really mean much of anything if you think about it. It's like, I used to follow professional sports, and then I realized that I get too emotionally wrapped up in it. And so if my team loses, it ruins my day. And why would I do that? Why would I want to be entertained? And instead I'm miserable and upset all day. And so I stopped watching professional sports. And that's kind of the race slavery question, the political question. People expend so much time and energy only to be really angry. Your life is not better, right? Your life, qualitatively speaking, is not better, unless, of course, you work for the government and your salary is tied to the election. Okay, fine. But we see this sort of binary choice, either or choice, all around us. Ukraine or Russia, masks or no masks, jabs or no jabs, vaccine mandates or no. It's either or. And that's kind of weird. And because this is the Subjective Professor podcast, we got to emphasize, you can believe whatever it is that you want, right? But if you want other people to agree with you, you got to try to persuade them, right? You can't coerce them with laws and regulations. You can't do that, because coercion only leads to bad outcomes, right? And so chances are, though, if people are going to the government to coerce people to make either or choices, that means really what's going on is that they don't want you to consider other factors. They don't want you to think about other things that might have influenced what we're seeing. Particularly, they don't want you to see the role of government in the shaping of whatever it is that we're seeing. We saw this with Marx. Remember when we were going over the Communist Manifesto? He totally ignores how the bourgeoisie, a minority in society, how the bourgeoisie was able to dominate and control the rest of the population, right? They were on the side of the government. They were using the structure of government to have their policies coerced on everybody else. And so really what we have to consider is, if we're only being given two choices, you can do your deconstruction and try to make a better choice. Or you can ask, what am I not being told? Why am I only being given two choices? Like, what do they not want me to see? What do they not want me to ask questions about? What do they want me to ignore, which would possibly undermine the entire choice, right? So I don't need to make that choice at all. I could just simply walk away. And in that process, you can listen to other people. You can listen to the Subjective Professor podcast, right? You can listen to other perspectives and then decide what works for you and what doesn't. Like you can sort of pick and choose. I like this, but I don't like that. So you can keep this, but I'm going to definitely run with this, right? And so we get to mix and match. And if you can mix and match, you'll realize that the majority of the United States is neither Republican or Democrat. And I think that's part of the game, right? To get you fixated only thinking in terms of Republican or Democrat, so you don't notice that you are neither, and that a lot of the representatives in Washington, D.C. really don't give a hoot about you, your life, whether you have enough food to eat, whether your kids are happy or not. They don't give a fig, right? And so, and that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. Like, what is it that makes you happy? What is it that's going to make the quality of your life better, right? What's going to help you sleep better at night? What's going to help you wake up in the morning and actually be excited to live that day, right? And if you want to have some of that, you got to get away from all of this binary discussion that a lot of people are engaging in today. I mean, you can believe whatever it is that you want, but the reality is, by pursuing our own personal agenda based on our own subjective perspective, chances are we are going to be happier. We'll be able to see the costs of the choices more clearly, and then your life will be much more fulfilling. I firmly believe that. But anyway, that's it for this episode. I will talk to you in the next.